All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with the influential philosopher, Michael Huemer. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado and the author of more than 80 academic articles in epistemology, ethics, metaethics, metaphysics, and political philosophy, as well as 10 amazing books that you should immediately buy. Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast, or not whatever this is, coming on the YouTube channel.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for that very generous and accurate introduction.
Yeah. Well, it's very easy because on your website, it lists all these things. So I just sort of copied and pasted it.
Oh, I assume that you just figured that all out.
Yeah. I deduced it from evolutionary theory. I just thought evolutionary. That's good. Imply that. So you have a bunch of books apparently. You must have a most recent one. What is your most recent book?
Yeah, look, this is my most recent book. It happens to be here. It's called Progressive Myths.
Wow, and, it's such a coincidence that you had it in your hand as I was asking.
Yeah, it's been endorsed or commented on by Erasmus. Says, when I get a little money, I buy Mike Huemer's books. If any is left, I buy food and clothes. Karl Marx says, if only I had listened to Mike Huemer, millions might not have had to die in the 20th century. And Satan says, this book is terrible. Never listen to Mike Huemer.
Yeah. Satan made similar claims about my... he routinely leaves similar comments on my blog articles. Everything in this article is wrong. Okay, so progressives believe some myths. This is the first I'm hearing about it. What are some of the myths that progressives believe?
Yeah, you probably didn't hear about it because the media is controlled by the leftists and the education system is controlled by leftists. Right, and by the way, even the leftists who are not themselves like woke ideologues, they usually are not prepared to call out the woke ideologue and their nonsense. But yeah, what are some of the myths? About the gender pay gap? Roughly that women get paid a lot less than men do for the same work. Sometimes it's said like women get paid 85 cents on the dollar. Or that's the most recent statistic. It used to be lower. Or another one is that the police in America frequently shoot unarmed Black people just because of racism. Just for being Black.
Yeah. How many unarmed Black people was it that are shot by police annually?
Yeah. So it's it's between 10 and 100, right? So yeah. The one year that I looked at it was like 30 something. Okay, and there's like I've forgotten how many Black people there are in the country, but it's tens of millions. So that's actually not shocking, right? Okay, and by the way, there are so if you like the total number of people who are killed by the police every year, in total it's something like 1,000 to 1,100 people get killed by the police every year. Most of them are armed. Some of them are unarmed, but they were doing something that was nevertheless quite threatening, like they were trying to take the cop's gun or something like that. Like you can deserve to be shot even when you're unarmed. Okay. And of those, like about a quarter of them are Black. Okay, so 3/4 of them are non-Black. Most of them are white people. However, the leftists freak out because less than a quarter of the population are Black. So only about 1/8 of the population is Black, and a quarter of the police shooting victims. So that shows racism, right? Okay, but the thing is, there's this even if you believe that argument, there's an even far worse evidence of prejudice, which is the anti-male prejudice. Right, which is that over 95% of the police shooting victims are male, right? And so, it's 95.5. So you're 21 times more likely to be shot if you're male than if you're female.
Yeah, well, that's obviously because men are culturally told to be violent. There's the mainstream cultural message, which says violence is great, but only when men do it, and men should do it. And that's why men throughout all societies in history and in similar species commit virtually all crimes.
Yeah, coincidentally. Well, I mean, I was assuming it was just because of sexism, because the police hate males, and that's why they're shooting, right? But then, I was assuming that, but then I decided, okay, well, just to be fair, I'm going to look at the crime rates, and it turns out that men commit 90% of the murders, and like virtually all of the cop murders of police officers. Okay, so then I thought, well, maybe, I don't know, it could be that they're being shot at higher rates because they're doing more violence against the cops. I don't know. they're more likely to do, threatening things when they encounter the police. Okay, so if you buy that, on this bizarre theory, we could look at the crime rates between different races, and it turns out that although Black people are only an eighth of the population, they commit 40% of the homicides and 43% of the homicides against police officers. So that could be why they're more likely to be shot by the police. As a matter of fact, it's disproportionately low. The rate of shooting Black people is disproportionately low compared to the rate at which Black people are committing homicides, especially of police officers.
Okay, so I guess sort of the thoughtful, like, progressive response would be, okay, look, it's true that, like, per arrest, it looks like white people are likelier to get shot by police than Black people. But that's just because police shooting Black people has been so heavily stigmatized in the media that that's a particular kind of police violence that's very stigmatized. Police know that if they shoot an unarmed Black person, there will be 10 million stories written about them, and so they're very worried about it. But with other kinds of police activity that are not primarily that are much more minor, like police searching people unlawfully or brutalizing someone, those they face much less backlash. They would claim that in the case of those, there's a lot more racial discrimination.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So in fact, so there's the police are less likely to shoot you if you're Black. And it is very plausible that that's because of the media attention. And there are cases where I quote people in the book, police officers saying something like this, right? Like there's a case of a cop who got beaten up by a Black guy, and he said part of the explanation was that he was hesitant to use force because he didn't want to appear in the media, right? But also, so if you shoot a white person, it's not going to be a national news story. It would be a local news story, but not a national news story, like if you shot a Black person. But also, if you do something less to a Black person, you don't shoot them, but like you rough them up a little bit, that's not a national news story either. So likely the police do, well, in fact, we know that they do give more attention to Black people as suspects. So. Okay, now what's the explanation for that? So I think the explanation for that is basically racial profiling. Right. So the police know that Black people are more likely to commit crimes. This is it's not my fault. It's like, it's not that I don't like Black people. And it's not necessarily that the cops don't like Black people. It's just that they know the statistics. Like they're more likely to commit crimes. So then, and so then you could have this debate about whether racial profiling is acceptable. Right. Because obviously irrational profiling would be unacceptable. You can't give this group extra attention just because you don't like them. Right. But what if you know that actually, in actual fact, they are more likely to commit crimes? Sort of like a philosophical question there.
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about in the book is there are, if you talk about a lot of things, but one of them is that you go through a lot of the high profile cases of police shootings. Yeah. And you note that basically the media spin about them is a complete 180 reversal of the facts. So what are some of the cases where the media has claimed that there was some unjustified police shooting, and you think they're just like totally wrong?
Yeah, well, the famous case was there's the Michael Brown case, there's the Trayvon Martin case. The Michael Brown case was fairly shocking, and we know what happened. Okay. The Trayvon Martin case, we don't really know what happened because, only the surviving person, only George Zimmerman actually saw what happened. Okay. Anyway, the Michael Brown case, we definitely know what happened, right? And, so Michael Brown, so he's a large Black man who got shot by a cop named Darren Wilson, I think. Okay. And then there was this narrative that grew up, which started with basically activists and people in the neighborhood saying that Michael Brown had surrendered, that he held his hands up and said, "Don't shoot." And then the cop gunned him down anyway because he's just a racist bastard. Okay. And we know what actually happened, right? What actually happened was, okay, so, well, we know that Michael Brown was like beating the cop while the cop was in his car, right? Cop is sitting in his car and Michael Brown is like punching him in the face. The cop says that Brown tried to take his gun. Okay, and we know that so Michael Brown is dead, so he can't give his testimony. Okay, but the cop gave his testimony, and all the forensic evidence is consistent with it. Okay, so there's like DNA evidence, like Michael Brown's DNA is on the guy's face, like it would be if he was punching him, and it's inside of the car, like it would be, right, and stuff like that. Okay, so Michael Brown punched him, and then like Darren Wilson manages to get his gun out and shoot through the door, and then Michael Brown runs down the street. Darren Wilson gives chase. And it was like just trying to keep Brown in sight so that he could wait for backup to arrive. And then Brown turns around and charges at him. And then the cop shoots a couple of times. Brown pauses, and then he starts charging again. And then Brown shoots. Then the cop shoots again and kills him. And we know that happened because of the forensic evidence, even though there were multiple people in the neighborhood who gave false testimony about it. That was actually one of the shocking things about the case. If you read the FBI report on it, the report on what all of these witnesses said, and it's like this rogues gallery of comically unreliable witnesses, like whatever, witnesses who have vision problems, witnesses who had previously been convicted for crimes of dishonesty, and whatever. Witnesses who, on questioning, admitted that they were at a location where they couldn't possibly have seen the thing. Right. But anyway, so some people testified that they had seen Michael Brown surrender and then the cop murdered him. But like, they were just like, in each case, there were just reasons why they clearly couldn't have seen that. Like they're contradicting just known facts about the case. Okay. But anyway, we know because of forensic evidence, because there's like where Michael, so the two of them were going this way down the street. And then the body is in a particular place in the street. And there are shell casings in this direction, right? The body is here. There are shell casings this direction when the two had been going that way. And so that means that Michael Brown had to be running and he had to pass where Darren Wilson was initially standing, right? So that meant that he was charging towards Wilson. Wilson was retreating. So, okay, anyway, might have been more detail than you wanted.
Yeah, no, that was good. One of the progressive myths that I've written about a bit is, and this is sort of like more of a kind of meta myth, conglomeration of a lot of different myths. One thing that nearly all progressives seem to believe is basically that women as a class are just like a deeply oppressed group, way more so than men, and are treated much worse than men. And they seem to believe this, where like, it's pretty clear, Black people are treated on average their lives are quite a bit worse than white people in the United States. They're poorer, they are more likely to be victims of crime and so on. And so people treat, when they're listing marginalized groups, they'll group women who are notably not a minority. They're in fact half the population in with these groups. It's like just not at all obvious whether on net women live better or worse lives than men, or like which sex is treated worse. Women on average seem to live longer and are happier. Men are the victims of nearly all violent crime.
We just know that, but yeah.
Well, actually, they do live longer. Whether they're happier there's a bit of uncertainty about that. And men are like the victims of nearly all violent crime. Many of the indicators that people look for as indicators of bias and prejudice, just they'll look at the implicit bias tests. It turns out when you do this for the sexes, people have just substantial implicit bias against men and in favor of women. If men and women commit similar crimes, like if you just have in studies, if you had just have one profile of a woman who commits a crime and another of a man who commits a crime, men get sentenced more. And there's in light of this fact, it at least seems very non-obvious which of the sexes is treated worse. Okay, and yet despite that, people treat it as this just totally obvious axiom that you can't doubt without being a bad person, that women are this deeply oppressed class that are across all of society horrendously oppressed. Sorry, that was kind of long wind-up, but
good. So there are these respects in which Black people are disadvantaged, and pieces of evidence that progressives give that black people are disadvantaged, and they also like the same the same things would indicate that men are disadvantaged, right? Yeah. So as you mentioned, black people, well, you didn't mention this, but black people tend to get harsher sentences than white people. So like the same nominal crime. Okay. So like you can never control everything. It's never all the same characteristics of the crime, but just look at what crime they were charged with. The black person is likely to get a longer sentence. And the same is true of men versus women. A man and a woman get charged with the same nominal crime, like the same statute. The man gets a higher sentence on average. Okay. So that would seem to, so, if that evidence suggests that white people are favored over black people in our society, or there's prejudice against black people, it would also suggest that there's prejudice against men. Yeah. And then there's this, implicit association test, which I don't know if the viewers know. So the implicit association test is, it tries to test how easy it is for you to form associations between concepts. And so one thing you could do is like try to see if people can form an association between black people and good things. And you sort of test how easy it is by timing, by reaction times. Okay, so like you're supposed to press a button if you see an image that relates to either black people or good things, and a different button if you see an image that relates to either white people or bad things. Okay, and then like the time delay for you to be able to sort things according to these categories indicates something about how easy it is for you to connect black people to good things. Okay, and it turns out that it takes a little bit longer if you're supposed to associate black people with good things as opposed to associating black people with bad things. Okay, and that shows allegedly shows an unconscious bias against black people. Okay, and we don't actually have strong evidence of this indicating real discrimination. Like there isn't really evidence that shows that this leads to any discriminatory behavior. But anyway, it's claimed to show that you have an unconscious racial bias. And the same test would indicate that we also have an unconscious bias against men in favor of women. And that is usually not reported by progressives and the people who are talking about the IATE, and the people who are going on about how it shows racism. And they just forget to mention that it also shows sexism against men.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There's also this just explicit attitudes. Like there are these just studies where they would just ask people how they feel about men as a group versus women as a group, and they feel better about women. And that's true of both men and women. So, and by the way, that's not surprising. That shouldn't surprise you if you live in our society, because like that's consistent with all of my experience. Like, frankly, I like women better than men. Just like, I don't just mean that I'm attracted to women more than men. I mean, just like I like being around them more. Just so, and so it's, if the question is just like, oh, does society have a preference for one sex? Yeah, it probably has a preference for women. That doesn't mean that women are overall better off. Like that's a really complex question, right? But there are ways in which women are clearly better off that are frequently neglected by the feminists.
Yeah, another related one is, and you had a good article called, I think, like For Nature or something, where people assume that insofar as there's a discrepancy between men and women, that it's just necessarily the result of prejudiced behavior rather than biology, even when the prejudiced behavioral explanations are totally ad hoc and don't make any sense, and the evolutionary explanations are like highly motivated, make very specific and accurate predictions, and like just explain the facts really well.
So it's like, this is like, I don't know, kind of an article of faith for progressives, right? It's an article of faith for progressives that biology plays virtually no role in explaining human behavior, and especially differences between groups. So like differences between male and female behavior. It's an article of faith that those have to be completely cultural and not biological. and people actually get upset when you give the biological explanation.
Yeah, and most especially if there's some group that is seen as oppressed, you can say that they do more good things as a result of genetics. But if the group is the oppressor, then genetics only result in them being defective in various ways. It can't result in them, being better in any respect.
Yeah. So, like I don't know. It's like a really strong case for the role of biology is. So like maybe the most obvious case is differences in sex drive. Men have way higher sex drive. They're much more willing to have sex much more quickly than women. Okay, and why is this? It's kind of obvious. Because like just in evolutionary theory, it's just like totally obvious that it has to be this way, right? Because for the male, well, like, okay, evolution selects for maximizing reproduction. For a male, the way to maximize reproduction is to impregnate as many females as possible. And like if you have a female partner and then you get another partner, then you double your reproductive success. But if you're female, you already have a male partner and you get another male partner, you do not increase your reproductive success at all. Right? Because you can still only reproduce once per 9 months, and one man is enough to get you pregnant. And like, you don't get any more offspring. You might get a little bit more resources if you get the second male partner. So maybe it slightly increases your expected reproductive success. Okay, but that's the explanation. And part of how we know this is it's also, besides it, it's just like a completely natural and obvious prediction of evolution. It's also cross-cultural. So it's not just like our particular culture, and it's cross-species. Right? Like the greater promiscuity in males is seen in other species. And so are you going to say like, oh, the other species it's due to their culture? So no, they don't have culture. Are you going to say like, oh, well, it's instinct
due to fish culture. They have really a robust culture of encouraging male promiscuity.
Yeah. Or are we going to say, okay, it's instinct for the other animals, but not for us? Like we're doing the same pattern, but for totally different reasons. The instincts got selected out at some time in the history of the evolution of human beings, but then coincidentally got replaced by cultural mechanisms that induce you to do the same thing. Right. Okay. So like that is the most obvious, example of the behavioral differences. But so like another, pretty strong case is differences in aggression. Right. So like men commit something close to 90% of the homicides. Women only 10%. Why is that? And like, okay, well, it's also cross-cultural. Like, different societies across the world, men commit most of the homicides or, whatever form of killings. And it's also cross-species. Well, in other species, murder is quite rare. It's quite rare for a species to kill conspecifics. However, the reason why it's happening among humans is that we're just a lot more dangerous because we have weapons. But in other species, it is common for the males to fight with each other. They usually don't fight to the death, but they fight with each other. And the females don't fight with each other, and the males don't fight with the females. It's just males fighting other males. Okay, so when you see in human beings, you see males fighting other males. It's probably the same thing. We're probably doing the same thing.
Yeah, and one thing that was interesting is that like the biological mechanisms are so well understood in biology that in the cases where they're like inverted, there's like a similarly good explanation of them. So there's a kind of octopus called the paper nautilus, where basically the way that the males reproduce is they find a female, then the female just rips off their reproductive organ and then uses that to repeatedly impregnate themselves. Wow. It doesn't sound like a great deal. This wouldn't be the way I would want to do it, but and so in this species, it's completely flipped. It's the females who are more aggressive and more likely to get into fights and are physically larger, and the males who are more choosy. Because if you have to commit to one partner for life and you die immediately after, well, there's a big incentive to be choosy. And so yeah. So in your article where you go over the case for there being for greater violence in males being a byproduct of biology, I at one point I was talking with some feminists who were treating it as just an article of faith that the fact that most of the good chess players are men is the byproduct of culture rather than the byproduct of biology. And she was super obvious that it can't be that that roughly 80% of chess players are men on account of anything biological. And so I was trying to see if she would agree at that that's more than 80% of crime being from men. Was that biological? She did not agree. This ended with her not being a big fan of me. When you raise these points to people, they often get very outraged. But
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think like most of what's going on is that some of the facts of reality are unpleasant. It is unpleasant that it's like an unpleasant fact of our world that men have sort of a predisposition towards violence. and it's a problem, and we don't know what to do about it. But what to do about it is not to bury our heads in the sand. and the explanations for why these things are the case are often very unpleasant, right? So like, okay, yeah, well, why did nature select for more aggression by men? Okay, and yeah, like, why is there all this war in human history? Okay, and the explanation is something like, well, in the past, men from one tribe used to like to go to another tribe and murder the men and then kidnap and rape the women. And the people who did that left behind more offspring than people who did not. And that's an extremely unpleasant thing to think about. And like that, and that we're the product of that because we're the descendants of those people. And we have their genes. So people do not want to think about that being the case. Okay? And then they think that because I'm saying that that's the case, that means that I like it. I don't like it. It's just reality. And we have to face reality if we're going to know what to do about it.
Yeah. Okay, so you disagree with all these progressive myths. So I assume as a corollary of that you'll love Trump and the modern Republican Party.
You would assume that, wouldn't you? But no, it turns out that I hate him. Yeah, and this may sound odd at first, but the reason why I don't like woke progressivism is the same as the reason why I don't like Trump, right? Which is that I like America. I like our system and what we have, okay? And I think both of them are undermining it. Okay, so like Trump is undermining America. Like he says he wants to make America great again, but like, no, part of what makes America great is, it didn't stop being great, okay? Part of what makes it great is the norms and institutions. Right. And like, okay, there's a lot of stuff about Trump, but the big thing that I had a problem with was not accepting elections. And by that, I don't mean talk, because that's what it sounds like people are complaining about when like, oh, he didn't concede the election. He didn't say I lost the election. No, I'm not talking about fucking talk, like what he says on Twitter or on Truth Social or whatever. I'm talking about he literally tried to not leave office. After the last election, like he convened slates of fake electors and actually produced fake election certificates and tried to get Mike Pence to count the fake votes and then declare him the winner of the election. And then just stay in office even though he had lost. And that is the sort of thing that undermines the norms. And I don't want to undermine the norms of our society because this is a great society. Like, this is better than what almost everyone in human history has experienced, and better than what almost everyone around the world experiences today. So, again, how are progressives similar to that? They are also kind of attacking America, right? And there's this line from the woke progressives that our society is based on oppression. Right. And the institutions are designed to oppress and exploit. Right. So that is also attacking our norms and institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree that there's a disturbing degree of similarity between the Trump administration and those on the far left, where they both seem to have this desire to this opposition to existing institutions and norms, this desire to burn everything to the ground. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is sort of alarming how few people seem to care about the fact that Trump literally attempted a coup, quite seriously, and got alarmingly close to succeeding. And just no one cares about that. If you talk about it too much, people say you have Trump derangement syndrome.
It's really deranged, Matthew.
Yeah.
That you care about that. Yeah.
I also think this administration, Trump too, it seems like he's breaching norms much more flagrantly than he did until the very end of Trump 1, where for example, he's just defying court rulings flagrantly. And if the president can ignore court rulings whenever they want, there are no checks on the president, because the branches that check the executive are Congress and the judiciary. And the way Congress checks the president is they pass laws which are then enforced by the judiciary. And so if the president just ignores the judiciary whenever he feels like it, then you don't in fact have a flourishing constitutional republic. You just have a dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what can he not do? right? Like assassinate political opponents. Like, what if he orders a drone strike on whatever Joe Biden? Well, Joe Biden won't run again, so it wouldn't matter. But maybe he orders a drone strike on Hillary Clinton, right? Okay, then what? And then who's going to do anything about that? And like he's in charge of law enforcement, right? So he'll just order the government not to investigate him, right? And then like somebody brings a legal case against him, and he'll be like, well, actually, there was this Supreme Court ruling that said that I have immunity for actions that I do as president, whatever, official acts. Okay, so and I was using the powers of the presidency, whatever, to drone strike Hillary Clinton, so I'm immune. And then like maybe the Supreme Court says, no, we don't agree. Actually, we didn't mean that. And then maybe Trump says, well, I don't care. Just like, and like then maybe the Supreme Court says, well, somebody should arrest Donald Trump. But actually, all of the people who would arrest him are his underlings, right? like he controls law enforcement. So I don't know what's in fact going to happen. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but like there doesn't seem to be very much to check his power at this point.
Yeah, it's quite alarming. Yeah, and like he's been talking about running for a third term, and you might think, oh, he won't. Of course, he won't run for a third term. That's ridiculous. Okay, but the guy tried to do a coup to hold on to power last time. And so it doesn't seem that, like, if a guy attempts to illegally declare himself president after losing, and the only reason he failed was that basically, like, there were sane people in the administration who are willing to stick up to him, namely Mike Pence, and all of those people are gone, then the idea that he might try to go for a third term is not totally unrealistic. It's not some, like, far-fetched fantasy. Yeah, I also find, there's a lot of stuff that's bad. One thing that I think is really bad, this hasn't been as egregious of a violation of norms, but it's just really alarming and that it will cause lots of people to die, is the ends to the PEPFAR program, which was this just hugely effective international aid program that saved about 26 million lives, where like even the aid critics generally granted that PEPFAR was super effective. And Trump just like axed it on day one, like restored tiny portions of it. And so now just like millions of people who are dependent on it are going to die. When the cost was like $10 per American. And even if you have your libertarian views, at the very least, you should, like, maybe it makes sense to have no government, but if you are going to have a government, axing the most effective government program that saves lives for like $1,000 doesn't seem great.
Yeah, that would have been one of the last things that I would have eliminated. Well, so I didn't hear about that. I haven't read about that.
This is why you should be reading my blog more. And you'll hear the news that the lamestream media won't tell you that. Well, they did write about it.
That's true. Yeah, you just for anyone, I don't know if there are any listeners who don't understand why it was a problem that Trump tried to stage a coup, or like, oh, don't worry, like, see, it didn't work. The guardrails held. Like, really, just imagine changing one person, right? Just imagine that Mike Pence is a little bit different, a little bit more sycophantic than he was. And Mike Pence does what Trump tells him to do. Okay, so when he's counting the votes, he counts the fake votes. Then what happens? Okay, and every single person, like, or at minimum, every Democrat knows that these are fake votes. Everybody has already heard the election results. Like, everyone knows who won each state. But Mike Pence just lies about it, and he says, well, I've got this election certificate that says, the opposite of what all of you guys know to be true, and I'm declaring Trump the winner. What happens? Okay, now, obviously, the Democrats, like, if you think of the game theory, the Democrats can't just go, okay, you won, right? Because that's like saying we give up the entire game. Like, if you can lose the election, but you still stay in office because you decided that you wanted to, then it's like you always win automatically. So the Democrats have to fight this. And then what happens? But like, he's already rejected the law. Like, it's already rejected our accepted procedures. So then what happens? It's like, well, now we have to resort to violence, right? Like, now we have to attempt to maybe assassinate Trump. Maybe we have to try to arrest him, but then like he orders federal officers to protect him from being arrested. And he's still the president at this point, right? Because this is just the vote counting. Another guy hasn't been inaugurated, so he's still the president. So they're still under his command. So like they, maybe he orders the military to defend himself against the Washington D.C. police. Then what? And then like somebody, like some Democrat has to try to stage an assassination or something. I don't know. Right. Okay. So like this is just total chaos. This could be like, Civil War time.
Yep. Doesn't.
Like, yeah. We're just lucky that didn't happen because Mike Pence grew a spine.
Yeah. Not good. And I mean, also like the recent administration has had pretty alarming attacks on free speech, where they've like deported people who are here legally just for the crime, just for like writing things critical of Israel in their college's newspaper. Yeah. And like, sent like a hairdresser to a brutal El Salvadoran prison with no due process. And then when the Supreme Court commands them to return him, they just like ignore the Supreme Court. Yeah. It's pretty alarming, the like just complete like disregard for dominant institutions and US norms. Like it does feel like we're moving alarmingly quickly in the direction of authoritarianism.
Yeah. By the way, I'm wondering if the Supreme Court is regretting some of their past decisions. Like when Trump was on trial, like the Supreme Court deliberately slow walking the case so that it wouldn't finish before the election, right? Because it was a majority Republican Supreme Court, 3 of whom were Trump appointees. They're like, I wonder if they're regretting this because now they realize that they can't control him. Now they realize that if there's something that actually does matter to them that they want to protect that Trump is violating, they can't, because they don't have a police force under their control and they don't have a military, and he does. Right? So like maybe, I don't know, maybe they should have thought more. And that immunity ruling that they had before the election, where like the president is he's immune for things that he does as official acts or something like that. Now, I have to go reread my blog post to remind myself of exactly what it was, but it was very like Trump friendly.
Yeah. Okay, so politics, we agree, not great what's happening currently. Woke left also bad. One thing that we might disagree about is the bugs. I'm a big proponent of bug rights. Okay, so I mean the basic case for so Mike, you accept the repugnant conclusion that if there were a sufficiently large number of people with barely worthwhile lives, then the world of that would be better than one with just like 10 billion people with amazing lives. Do you accept the rebugnant conclusion that how we treat bugs is just like the most important moral priority by a lot?
Rebugnant. I mean, I was thinking that bugs are not sentient, so I was thinking they would count for nothing. I'm not completely sure of that.
But so by kind of conservative estimates, it looks like about 3 trillion bugs die a second. And so if you think like that, or actually, no, sorry, I think 3 trillion was not that conservative, was like just like the standard estimate, but 300 billion by conservative estimates. If you think that like bugs probably aren't conscious, well, even if you think that that there's a 1% chance that they're conscious and conditional on them being conscious, there's a 1% chance that they're 1% as conscious as we are. Yeah. And just like there's so many of them that it just looks like the worst thing in the world. And and by the way, it's not like there are lots of things that are like, there are like quadrillions of fish in the deep ocean, but we don't really have any effect on them. Okay, but we affect quadrillions of bugs. We've reduced insect populations by maybe about 70%, according to some estimates. I've heard some people say those estimates.
Wow.
limits are too high.
That's impressive. But really, like across the world, not just in populated areas?
Yeah. Now there's dispute about that. So looks like that might be, maybe more conservatively, it's more like 10%. But we're somewhat in the dark. But yeah, there are lots of estimates that say we've reduced the bug populations really by a lot. And so if you think bugs matter like basically at all, then I think, or that there's even a tiny chance that they matter at all. There's just so many of them that, like, in expectation, almost all suffering on Earth is had by bugs. And so then it looks like how we treat bugs is like the most important thing in the world.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, yeah, a couple of things. Well, okay. I mean, maybe there are more bugs than there are any other kind of animal, but you only have to count the ones that are being affected by us, right? So I don't know what the numbers are with that, right?
So like for just for context, so Brian Tomasek did a sort of rough Fermi calculation, and he was pretty conservative in this number. So he assumed that we've only reduced bug populations by about 10%. And he found that if this is right, if you give a dollar to give well, that reduces the number of insects by about 14,000 that are alive at any given time.
Okay, because the longer a person lives, the more bugs they kill.
Yeah, and the more that they just like more humans equals more taking over habitats that once belonged to the bugs, and so then fewer bug populations.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there are three things that I wonder about. Okay. Well, I don't know. I guess two things. Okay. So one is like I'm not sure that they're sentient at all. So like there's probably some minimum. There's some minimum brain size or brain sophistication to be sentient, and they may not be because like they all have like brains that are literally a millionth the size of a person's brain. I think that's a typical thing, right? And then you might think, well, okay, like even if they are sentient, maybe they're only a millionth as sentient if there are degrees of awareness, But it might also just be zero because you have to reach a certain threshold to be sentient at all. The other thing that I worry about is I'm not sure that their lives are overall good rather than bad. Like, is the life of an insect mostly pleasure or is it mostly pain? Or, even if they are sentient, it's not obvious that it's good rather than bad experiences.
Yeah. So I very much agree with the third point. And in fact, I'd go a lot further. I wouldn't say I'm not sure whether they're more good than bad. I'm pretty sure they're more bad if they're conscious. And the argument for that is just most insects are strategists, meaning they give birth to enormous numbers of offspring, very few of whom survive. So if you give birth to, if you have 500 offspring and only 2 of them will survive, that means almost all of them die super young and painfully. And, they often die from like starving to death or getting like partially crushed to death and then slowly dying over the course of hours. In any case, it's not the most pleasant. It seems like, and so,
not the most pleasant, you could say.
Yeah. So I would say, I think this is a reason to be like very pro civilization and the human species and saving lives. It's even better than we thought, because it just reduces bug populations, and that's like just the most important thing in the world, to reduce bug populations. If bug suffering is just like many orders of magnitude bigger of a deal than poverty or war.
Maybe, yeah.
Regarding the point about bugs, whether bugs are conscious or whether if they are conscious, they're very conscious. Yeah. Well, even if you think they're only a little conscious, like there are enough of them that it's very important. And I don't think there's any good reason to think that like having just physically small brains or brains with few neurons correlates with how intense your experience are. So for instance, if you look at in humans, if you want to figure out how intense a human's experience are, humans experience is. You don't look at how many neurons they have active. And in fact, experimentally, that has basically no correlation, and often an inverse correlation with the intensity of their experiences. Rethink Priorities commissioned a kind of long and detailed report where they looked at whether there was a correlation between neuron number and consciousness. And their guess was probably that neuron count is just not a very good proxy for consciousness. It's better to look at certain like behavioral proxies. So like how sophisticated the creature's mind is, what sorts of things it does. I think their overall estimate was that probably the intensity of their experiences is within like 2 orders of magnitude of the intensity of ours, and maybe more, after commissioning a pretty detailed report. And so if you think like, that has even any chance of being right, to me, it seemed pretty reasonable, then I think that insect suffering ends up looking really important. Like for context, like salmon and bees have similar-ish numbers of neurons. And so if you like, I think we can be biased against insects just because they're really small. But like if they were just like physically larger, it would seem weirder to think that they just don't have any intense experience. In terms of whether they're conscious at all, I guess I think they are probably conscious. So like insects, they respond to anesthetic. They make trade-offs between pain and reward. So if you like inflict some amount of pain on them in order to get food, they'll like make a calculation of like how much pain they're willing to endure for the food. And if you give them anesthetic, then they're willing to endure pain for the food. If they endure pain in a location, they avoid it in the future. They can become addicted to drugs. Some of them can communicate. Like bees can do a bunch of smart stuff. I think at the very least, this is enough to make it sort of at least not totally implausible that they're more than minimally conscious.
Yeah, I mean, so what I read was that there are these cases where like the insect has been grievously injured and it's still acting like normal. Like it continues eating or continues mating, even though like it's just had this like mortal injury, like, its abdomen has been crushed or whatever. It's like lost a couple of legs and it's still doing its thing, like which you would not possibly do, right? Because of the amount of pain that you would have. About the correlation between neuron count and consciousness, like I'm wondering how you could do a study on that, because like how do you know the level of consciousness? What's the empirical test for the level of consciousness?
Well, the idea is just if you look at like more intense experience, like you compare cases where people have really intense pain to cases where people have more mild pain, and then you look at what the neural proxies are for that, and actually the more intense pain generally has fewer active neurons.
Yeah. I mean that,
or like when people are on psychedelic drugs, they seem to have like super crazy and intense experiences. And then you look at their brains, and their brains are actually less active than during normal waking life. And like, for anyone who's done psychedelic drugs, of course, not that I ever have or would.
Yeah, no, obviously, we don't know.
Deeply immoral, violation of the law. I think it's generally clear that your experiences are more vivid than is typical.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure how convincing that is. Because the thought would be that, well, like just a particular organism, just like its total neuron count sort of affects its kind of like how conscious all of its experiences are, right? It's just like, because I have a lot of neurons, just like all of my experiences are kind of somehow sort of like more felt. And
yeah, I mean, so so you could but then I think if you thought that, you would predict that in cases where humans have more active neurons, we'd have more intense experiences. We'd be more like intensely conscious. And then that doesn't seem to be right. That also, like, humans have way more neurons than like cows, and elephants have more neurons than humans. And so you'd have to think that just like elephants' experiences, if you try to like linearly extrapolate from the number of neurons, then you'd have to think that like one elephant is worth like thousands of cows.
Well, wait, that sounds like an overstatement there, right? Isn't it?
Let's see. How many times? I'm going to ask Claude. More neurons do elephants
Good.
have than cats?
Yeah, what do you think about that? I mean, so it's not necessarily just the neuron count, like, so just sort of like features of the brain in general. So, like the insects are just going to have less sophisticated brains, fewer neurons, but like everything else that's going on, like whatever total information processing capacity or whatever is going to be a lot lower. And like, not a little bit, like, by like 6 orders of magnitude or something like that lower.
Yeah. So okay. So I was wrong that cows, they only have about 3 times more neurons than cows, but they have about 1,300 times more neurons than chickens. And
Wow.
so, and this is just because they're like larger organisms, so they have physically larger brains.
Yeah.
Like in other organisms, it's pretty unintuitive that like the results you get from neuron count seem pretty unintuitive. And like there are cases of humans just losing a bunch of neurons, like, and then they don't seem to report their experiences being much less vivid. But right, so, and I agree that insects have that they have simpler brains, and for this reason we should think they're less conscious. I guess I would say that it doesn't seem like I think taking that into account, my like mean estimate would be within a few orders of magnitude of the intensity of our consciousness.
Yeah.
And even if you think that there's only like a 1% chance that's right, there's so freaking many of them that like it just ends up being the most important thing in the world by orders of magnitude.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like it might be one of these things where like there's a small probability that it's super important, right? And then, but the majority, the greater probability is that it's not important at all. But you have to take it into account anyway because it might be super important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's at least decently likely that I'd put it at more than 50% odds that insects are conscious. And I could talk about the thing I'll discuss your counterpoint in a moment. But so if insects are conscious, even if you think they're only barely conscious, like suppose you think you're so confident that insects are not conscious that you think that that in the like 1 second that over the entire course of an insect's death, the total amount of pain that causes is only as bad in expectation as one human scraping their knee.
Yeah.
Well, so it looks like maybe trillions of insects die per second. Yeah. So what you get is like insect suffering would be as bad if at any given time there was just a population like 10 or 100 times larger than Earth who had just had the constant experience of scraping their knee. Yeah. And like that would probably be the worst thing in the world if they were just like the population way larger than the population of Earth is just constantly experiencing mildly unpleasant pain. Yeah. That would be like the biggest deal in the world by a lot. So even if you're really conservative and you think that insect suffering is only that bad, like it's the worst thing in the world, especially if you correctly, like you do, think that a lot of small pains can aggregate to be as significant as a single very large pain. Even if you don't think that, I think you should think it's plausible enough that insects are above the threshold for experiencing significant pain that it ends up being really bad in expectation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, like I think we have sort of similar practical views, right? Which is right, because like most of the people who would be saying this would be saying, "Oh, so now we need to stop killing insects," right? But actually, think no, we need to expand civilization, which I guess
we need to kill more insects.
Yeah.
But I mean, this does have some implications at the margins. So, like, it'll maybe mean that like charities that save humans are better than like it'll probably mean that charities that save humans are better than charities that save like farmed animals, because if every dollar you give to GiveWell, like reduces the number of insects at any given time by about 14,000. And I think, and so then that like, given that insects are our strategists, this like prevents a very large number of insects from coming into existence.
So I did want to say one other thing about the whatever consciousness, because I read a little bit about this, but I'm not an expert on this, like how you think about how conscious something is. And so I did say this stuff about the neuron count, but I don't think it's that simple. Like there's probably a lot more to the brain than just the number of neurons, right? So like because it could be, well, it's partly about the number of neural connections. And so so I think elephants have bigger brains than humans, isn't that right?
Yeah,
they're not smarter than us. Right, but
they're smarter than some people, but not than you and I, certainly.
That's right, yeah.
I could take any elephant in a chess match.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. We're smarter than an elephant. Okay.
The elephant would start knocking around the chessboard with its trunk. I would completely wreck that elephant.
Yeah, that's right.
You'd have no chance.
In fact, I bet it wouldn't even be able to move one of the pieces, So
it would surrender immediately just by knocking over its king.
But anyway, so it's more complex than just the neuron count, and I don't know the details of like everything that's relevant in the brain. So the number of neural connections is relevant. It also might be like particular parts of the brain that are especially relevant. So like maybe the frontal lobes are more relevant, maybe the neocortex is more relevant, stuff like that. Okay, but it's something about the brain is going to lead to higher consciousness, lead to there being consciousness and maybe higher levels. So I hope that the insects are not sentient, because I couldn't say that I know that they're not, but I hope that they're not.
Yeah, I think so. Right. So there are different views about how you like measure about what proxies you should look at consciousness. I guess I think the best work on the subject was done by Rethink Priorities, where they compiled a really detailed report looking at a bunch of behavioral proxies to try to estimate the extent of animal consciousness. And their guess was, like for bees, I think their mean estimate was that bees experience pain 15% as intensely as we do. Okay, and that might seem high, but bees are they're like surprisingly smart. Like they're smarter than some fish. And two,
higher than other insects. Right?
Yeah, and also, like, if there's lots of uncertainty where we just don't really know the proxies for consciousness, then like a lot of that was low probability that they're like really conscious, like near to where we are. Regarding the point about how insects, like, you'll start eating them and they'll just like keep mating or whatever. So there was a paper on this that's like that's very widely cited by Eisman. I think you cited in your book where you're talking about why you don't think insects are conscious. But there's been there was a kind of lengthy reply by Megan Barrett called The Era After Eisman, where she goes over some reasons to be doubtful of the original findings of the Eisman paper. So I think there are like a couple of points. One of them is it's like what Eisman did was just based this on like observations of some insects in the lab in a few labs over the years. Yeah. Okay, but that so even if you buy that, that'll tell you that some insects are not conscious, but it won't tell you that all of them are not conscious. Okay, and once again, even if you think only 1% of them are minimally conscious in expectation, then it ends up being the most important thing. So like it wouldn't be that shocking if like the simpler insects were not conscious, but the like super smart insects like bees are I mean not that, like, you know, as I said, I could beat the bees in chess very easily. And if they try to do philosophy, like they would just fail completely. Like if a bee tried to do philosophy, you'd give them a thought experiment and they'd probably say like, oh, that's not realistic.
That's right,
yeah. You give them the trolley problem and they're like, oh, what if the trolley became a bunch of balloons or something? They just start saying, you know,
what if one of the people on one of the tracks is Adolf Hitler? Then what?
Yeah.
This reminds me that there was a science fiction novel by Cixin Liu where there are these conscious, intelligent ants. It's about a time in the distant past when dinosaurs and ants each had a civilization and symbiotic. And, it has the ants talking to the dinosaurs and stuff like that. And I found it unrealistic. You would probably really relate to it, and you'd be rooting for the ants.
Now I'd be rooting against the ants. We need fewer ants.
Yeah. In the story, it seemed like the ants were having a good time.
Okay, then I'd be rooting for the ants.
But it wasn't mentioning how many of them die when they reproduce. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, crucial oversight in the story. I bet many people were left wondering about that. Sent many emails to the author. What were the ants' reproductive strategies like? So a lot of the stuff in the Eisman paper looked at like an insect will have been injured a while ago, so it'll have like broken a limb, and then it'll like walk on the limb or something. But one thing that seems plausibly true of fish and also potentially true of insects is that it looks like they have like the immediate shooting chronic pain. Sorry, opposite of chronic pain, like the immediate shooting pain when you cut someone. But they don't really have chronic pain. And so if that's true, that would explain the findings of why like they seem to kind of ignore injuries after they've gotten them, but they behave. But when you do injure them for the first time, then they act very aversively. And this is kind of what you'd expect if insects have these really short lives. Like having lasting chronic pain that like influences their behavior in the long term isn't that beneficial. But just like thing hurts them, they try to get away. Would be more beneficial. And also like in general in humans, the reason why pain is beneficial is like if we feel pain in a limb, then we'll avoid walking on a limb. But insects just have very different like skeletal structures, so it's not as damaging for them to walk on injured limbs. And so for that reason, I think you just expect I don't think we can be confident that insects don't feel pain from the fact that some of them, some of the time, when they're injured, act like they're not.
No, it seems like somebody should do more experiments and see injure them right before you observe the behavior and see what happens there. Do we know about like the nerve cells that are in the limbs and stuff like that? Like, are they sending pain signals?
Yeah, insects do have nociceptors.
Yeah.
Now, there's a further question about whether they actually experience pain or they just have like harm, like sensors to damage, but at least some evidence that they feel pain.
Yeah. So like, obviously like, well, we know about the problem of other minds, right? And you can't actually prove that. You can't prove that anyone's having experiences. So, you might think, oh, okay. So like they respond to anesthetics. Like I've heard that, but like the hypothesis wouldn't be that there's nothing going on. Like when the nociceptors are stimulated, right? It would be that, well, there's just like some mechanism, some like sort of stimulus response mechanism, and it responds to bodily damage or something. It causes pain-like behavior, but maybe there's nothing going on inside. And think, okay, so it responds to anesthetics, but you would kind of expect that, right? Because it's going to be deactivating whatever, maybe the activity of the nerves that were sending the pain signals or whatever circuits are in the tiny insect brain that would lead to the pain behavior is deactivating that. So, right. So,
yeah.
Right. Now, and you might say though, like, oh, this is kind of unfair because like, well, you could also hypothesize that other people aren't feeling pain, right? Because you can only observe their behavior. You can't like observe their pain. And like, maybe people are just stimulus response mechanisms and you just deactivate part of that mechanism, whatever.
Yeah, I agree.
You're going to say, yeah.
So I think that I agree the inference as you get to minds less like ours gets sketchier and sketchier. So like we can be almost certain, but not quite. We can be certain that we're conscious. We can be almost certain, but not quite that other humans humans are conscious. We can be very confident, but a bit less certain that like other mammals are conscious. Fish, we're even more uncertain, and then insects, we're even more uncertain than that.
Yeah.
But the being sort of like behaves in a bunch of ways as if it's conscious, and like in a bunch of ways other than just like avoids things that harm it, like, you know, it responds to anesthetic and so on. I think it's at least plausible that it's conscious. And all that's needed for the rebugnant conclusion is that it's not like super improbable.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So are you going to become, you know, go out, become a big bug rights activist, advocate for bugs to have the right to be killed,
to prevent their being?
Yeah, a bug anti-right activist. Where you just
That's right. Yeah, is it? Would that be respecting their rights? Actually, well, anyway, they probably wouldn't have rights, even so. But yeah, a bug welfare activist. The best thing for them is to not exist, and right, because like, you know, welfare level 0 is better. Yeah, maybe there are tiny disembodied bug souls, right, that are waiting to get embodied in the bug body, and those souls have a right to not get embodied, and so we should try to prevent that.
Yeah, seems right. Yeah, one practical takeaway is, if you think insect suffering is really important, probably you shouldn't eat insects, because you need to eat just huge like they're really small, so you need to eat huge numbers of them in order to like feed yourself for a meal. And we should be pretty concerned about insect farming, where there are some organizations like the Insect Institute that are trying to reduce the extent of insect farming, where that seems pretty good, because we're like breeding trillions of them in hellish indoor conditions. Oh, and then, by the way, we feed them to tortured farmed fish.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're being fed to humans as a replacement for factory farming. They're in fact being fed to factory farmed animals, and so doesn't seem good.
Wait, what insects are we raising on farms? This sounds disgusting. Like, who wants to eat insects? Like,
well, no. So we're raising mostly, I mean, different ones. Like, you know, we raise silkworms for silk, but the ones that are being eaten are primarily black soldier flies, and they're mostly right. So people don't want to eat them, and so what they do is they feed them to farmed fish.
I see.
Because they're like cheaper or something than the other food. I mean, it's mostly a fairly small industry, but it's likely to increase. Right now, it's only like a trillion black soldier flies, but it'll be like 30 trillion, it looks like, in the not too distant future.
Okay, yeah. All right, so let's stop doing that. I guess,
yeah. See, yeah, you're gonna shut down your black soldier fly farm.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna stop eating fish. Well, I wasn't eating fish, but that would be another reason not to.
Yeah. It is. So one of the replies to your book, Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism, what came from Brian Kaplan, where he says that, you appeal to this ethical principle. You shouldn't cause others tons of extreme agony for small personal benefit. But that's just crazy when you think about the implications. It implies that, that you don't get to torture trillions of bugs for slight personal benefit. It implies that, if your action to, like, I don't know, drive to the store cause deleterious effects to huge numbers of bugs, it would be wrong. And it's just like, it almost feels like there's something different going on when Brian Kaplan does moral reasoning than when I do, where like it almost feels like what he's doing is an exercise in just like finding things about the world that would sound weird, and then if you can like offload them onto the opposing view, then like that's a cost for them. When like, no, of course, if it turned out that by your action to drive to the store, you just caused like huge amounts of agony for tons of creatures, and it was for small personal benefit, like, Of course that would be morally wrong, because it's morally wrong to cause like suffering's bad. This isn't because we can do calculus or are smart. Like the badness of your headaches have nothing to do with how smart you are. And like, so if we're causing this to these creatures that are not smart, but we're just causing them huge amounts of agony, like obviously that would be wrong. It'd be very inconvenient that it's wrong, but
this reminds me of, okay, so there's another reference to Cixin Liu, the science fiction author. But in the three-body problem, there's a point where, okay, so the aliens, the Trisolarans, they've been doing these whatever advanced physics particle experiments. And at some point, they discover that when they do these experiments, they're actually destroying entire universes. Okay, and so then the alien government decides to use this to give an argument that destroying other civilizations is not a big deal. Because we destroy universes all the time. So like it's not such a big deal if we go and destroy the Earth. If we kill the humans or cause the humans to go extinct. No big deal. We've been doing that all along. Okay, and now like that's obviously bad, but you can sort of understand the feeling there, or you can sort of understand like what they would be appealing to. It's not like totally implausible that there would be some psychological influence in this direction. If you find out that you've been doing this all along, then you sort of like downplay how important it is, and then other horrible things that are similar start to seem better. Like that's the Brian Kaplan thing, right? Like
you can imagine some hypothetical economist in this world named Schmayan Schmaplin, who thinks that this vindicates it completely.
Yeah, he's a Trisolaran. That was probably the guy in the Trisolaran civilization who was making that argument.
I remember one thing you said in your book that I found quite convincing is, if the world is weird, just as a matter of fact, then there should be weird ethical judgments. So like you were responding to the charge that thinking factory farming is the worst thing in the world is weird. Like, well, it's unintuitive because we don't normally like vividly consider the fact that we're torturing a population like as large as the number of people who have ever lived every 2 years, causing more agony in a few years than has ever existed in all of human history. When you take into account that fact, well, that the world is weird and that we're just doing way more bad stuff to animals than to people, then it stops seeming as weird. And I think that's a more thing about insects, that when you like, the thing that's weird is that we like massively affect the lives of quadrillions of insects. And we don't think that's bad just because insects are small and weird looking and like it's inconvenient to care about them. And so we just never feel empathy for them. So given that our moral judgments are largely driven by emotion, like no one has any emotions about mistreating insects. So just no one cares about it, even if they're convinced abstractly that it's a bad thing.
No, that's right. I mean, yeah, so, like here's a somewhat more general thing, right? Like, how they say you can't infer an ought from an is? Now, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but surely you can't go the other way, right? Like you can't just take your moral judgments and then figure out the descriptive facts of the world from your moral judgments, right? Like something has gone wrong there, okay? So like that's kind of like what the Kaplan argument is doing, right? And or like the argument that we're doing this all the time, and that wasn't his argument. Like we're doing this all the time, so it can't be that bad. But like that is psychologically what's going on, right? The fact that you realize that you're doing the thing all along, like we're all doing it every day in actions that we're used to and we're used to thinking are perfectly fine. They're constantly having this effect that we don't think about. But when we attend to the fact that they're constantly having this effect, then that is creating a psychological influence to judge that effect not to be so bad, right? But that's clearly bad reasoning because like you can't figure out, just like from your sense that the thing is okay, like that. So
like if you have a sense that the thing is okay because you haven't considered important facts about it, then you can't use that sense to prejudge whether the important facts about it are true.
Yeah.
Like you can't can't say, oh, of course driving to the store is fine without considering the impact on insect suffering, and say, thus, it must be that insect suffering is important if your intuition that driving to the store is fine was formed without thinking about the impact on insect suffering. Now, I think that driving to the store is fine, is perhaps even praiseworthy because it makes there be fewer insects. But
yeah, I realized that what I was saying there was unclear, and I think I got confused there because it's more like the inference is this is common, so it's not so bad, right? So like just the facts about, you know, how often something is going on, that shouldn't influence your judgments about like the fundamental moral values.
Yeah, like,
but it clearly does.
Yeah, an example that I gave when I wrote a reply to Kaplan on this was like, imagine we discovered that just like, well, actually, this is kind of similar to your example, but we discovered that bacteria were just super smart and intensely conscious. This would have like really inconvenient ethical judgments. This would imply that basically every time you like take antibiotics, you're committing genocide of an intelligent civilization.
Yeah.
But this wouldn't be a good reason to think, well, then I guess if you're really small, you don't matter. It would just be a reason to think the world's really ethically inconvenient so that the right ethical views imply very annoying things. It feels like people go the other way, where they just assume our ordinary practices can't be unjustified without considering the relevant facts, and then use that verdict to assume that the relevant facts have to turn out so that our ordinary moral practices are not justified. I mean, are justified.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like, so, you know, just, I don't know, this is repetitive, but, you know, you can get a radical ethical conclusion if the facts are surprising. So, like, yeah, we shouldn't be surprised that somebody gets like this, you know, radically revisionary ethical view if it turns out that there's a bunch of facts that like our common sense moral views didn't take into account and that are really surprising. Yeah.
If every time you scratched your ear, an infinite number of people were tortured to death, scratching your ear would be the worst thing you ever did. In fact, it would be so bad that you should probably like preemptively kill yourself just so that you don't scratch your ear.
I would just have our ears amputated.
Yeah.
That'd be easier.
It would be silly to say, well, we all know a priori that scratching your ear is fine. Oh, it's so ridiculous to think that our ordinary practice of scratching your ear, it's a Morian fact that we get to scratch our ear. Very, very silly. All right. So we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes roughly. Any closing thoughts? Any final words?
Everybody should buy my book and also go to my blog and read my blog.
Oh yeah, I should link your blog. For those who don't know, for some reason, due to their craven wickedness, what's your blog called?
Fake News, FAKENOUS, on Substack.
Yeah, and it's accurate only in the cases where you talk about utilitarianism. There you perpetrate fake news, but in other cases,
that's right. Most of the posts are actually not fake. You know, they're not news, but they are noose. So,
yeah. All right. Thanks for coming on. I guess I'll end the stream.
Okay. Thanks for watching. Great talking to you.